Hi, I'm artist and instructor Karen Walker, and the subject of this alcohol ink painting demonstration is the blue iris. I've decided to paint this iris against a solid black background, and I'll be using a technique of successive masking, where I will mask twice, once to preserve the whites and a second time to preserve the blues. We'll begin by masking off the white areas. Looking at the reference photo at the left, we'll determine which areas we'd like to preserve the whites in, and I'll just put a light layer of masking over the whitest parts of the flower. I'm also tracing around the edge of the flower. Here is the finished version of the very first pass of masking. What I'll do now is add a layer of blue ink over the flower, and I'll be covering all of the areas, including the stem area, with the blue ink. I'm actually beginning with a cool Perry, and this is a beautiful periwinkle color, which is very close to the color of the iris in the photograph. And even though I will be adding another blue into it, I think this is the color that I really ended up liking the most. But adding two colors gives a little bit of variation and makes the flower a little bit more interesting. You'll notice that the periwinkle ink has separated a bit and leaves a nice pink edge. So the use of successive masking allows us to keep part of it white and then put a layer of ink on and maintain that color. So after this layer of ink is dry, we'll be able to mask again. The second layer of masking will cover over the entire flower and all of the blue that we've just put on. And I'm using a much larger brush, and I have to work somewhat carefully because I don't want to pick up any of the masking that I put on the first time. And we're masking here to cover over the whole flower so that I can add that beautiful thick background layer of black ink. This layer of masking fluid is somewhat thicker than the first layer we put on, so it'll take a little bit longer to dry. Once it is thoroughly dry, we'll add the black wash. And I don't normally use black ink. In fact, I really just have the same bottles that I had my original time I bought ink. But now this is a good time to use it. It's very thick and luxurious, and I'm going to go all the way around the flower and put the ink on the paper. I want to solidly cover the paper with ink, and even though it won't harm anything to have the black ink cover the flower, I will try to avoid it just to make sure that we don't inadvertently get black ink in the center of the flower. But if we trust our masking fluid, it should be fine either way. You can see that as little white spaces appear in the inking, I can try to make them disappear by adding a little bit more ink over them. And I'm rotating the paper to control the flow of the ink and try to have it flow kind of away from the blossom. This is a bit of a leap of faith to think that the masking fluid is going to hold up under all of this black ink, but we'll let you in on a secret, it works just fine. Here is the finished layer of dry black ink, and you can see it did come over the flower a little bit, but we will remove that masking fluid now that the ink is very dry, and I remove it by just trying to rub it off with my finger. One of the things I need to be careful of is to not mar the black ink surface, because one of the features of this painting is this solid black background, and we don't want to get it all messed up. So I'm working on trying to find all of the different areas of masking fluid over the stems and leaves and the whole flower. But you can see that the white areas did remain white and the blue areas are blue. So I think this masking fluid worked out fairly well. The next bunch of steps will be to start to bring out the texture of the petals. And I'm starting with the cotton swab, and I'm looking at the reference photo at left and just finding the areas that are light. And this will add some structure to these petals and just slowly begin to bring out the details. And I'm just going to work my way all the way around the flower. And we're just pulling off some of this blue ink. With the brush, I will add back in some of the periwinkle color. And my original photograph it's a little bit more on the periwinkle side than blue. And I'll be trying to bring back some of these purples into it. The brush offers a little bit more control than the lifting we did with the cotton swab, so we're just further defining. The nice thing about the iris project is from very early on it definitely looks like an iris. Sometimes the ink paintings look quite messy for a long time, but this one you can see the structure of the flower pretty well even at this early stage. The periwinkle is an interesting ink in that it's very, very light, so it's full of alcohol, and half the time it seems to really act more like the alcohol and lift off the ink that's on the paper as opposed to actually putting on the new color. So we need to be careful with that. But here is where we are at this point after having lifted with the cotton ball and adding in some of the periwinkle. It's time now to work with some darks, and this is a dark purple, and we'll be looking back through the reference photo and finding some of the darker areas to put this in. And I'm using the brush so as to not put on too much ink and just tapping it in carefully. And continuing all the way around the flower for all of the dark areas. At this point, I will work on the leaves, and we're adding in some citrus. I've left the blue, the original blue, on the stems, and this will give some variation in these green tones, which I think is a little bit more interesting than if I had just painted it a solid light green color. The next step will be to lighten and soften the flower. It's gotten a bit linear with all of the brushwork we've done, and using the cotton swab will change the texture a bit. We want it to have that crepey kind of texture that flower petals have. This will also blend in any harsh lines that might have accidentally happened. And here you can see the texture that the cotton swab has left. We'll be going back, adding some more details back in after having just gotten rid of them, and still working on adding some more darks. And this adds some considerable amount of color. We really want to darken in this area in the center where all the petals come together. That's a naturally more shaded area. We'll now turn to using the brush to lighten back some of these areas that we just darkened. So this is with the alcohol. And we're slowly building contrast and dimension in the flower. And as we're lifting, we're kind of pushing some of the ink down as well. So kind of sculpting out some of these petal areas. I'm breaking up the larger purple spot up here at the top. And this was done with some eggplant. When I had finished with some of that brighter purple, I added in some details with the eggplant, which is a darker purple. But this particular area had gotten a bit solid and needed to be broken up. And as I paint, I'm continually checking the reference photo to determine where these different folds in the petals are. Here we'll add in a few more darks, shading the side of the stem, and we're using the eggplants again. The cyclical process continues by working on some of the lighter passages. And the cotton swab again will soften these areas. And the coloration of the iris has become kind of half purple, half blue. Working with the cotton swab, one needs to be very careful not to get too much alcohol on it, and especially not to drip on the black background. One of the risks of working with such a solid background is that if any kind of damage came onto it at this point, it would be relatively impossible to fix and maintain the solid nature of the background. We'll be introducing a new color now, the butterscotch, to put in the beard for the iris. And I think this little touch of an additional color helps pop the flower. And it works well since it is the complement of the purple that we've been using. And I can bring a little bit of it down into the leaves, which will brighten the leaves and add just a little variation in color there. The leaves still look a little bit strange. There are these black lines in there, and I think they need to go. So I will be removing the black ink that's in there with the cotton swab. And I'm doing this in preparation of putting in some more green ink, but we need to take out the black first. And the cotton swab is a great tool for this. The ink is pretty thick that's on there, and you can get a fair amount of pressure on the cotton swab that will remove it. And it's leaving behind a stain that's in the blue range, and that's just fine for being underneath the green. And now I'm putting in the green, following along the edge of the leaf. And the black ink that's in the background sort of acts like some sort of a dam in preventing the green from overflowing. So it's a little bit easier than if there were no other ink on the paper. And this ink is going on pretty easily and really picking up some of these underneath either the staining or the little bits of ink that are left over. Now, I tried to not use the pen at all in this demonstration, but these leaves, the outside edges are not as straight as I would like them to be. And I'm going to head and just use the black pen and make them just a little bit more tidy. Luckily, the black ink will blend in with the black ink that's on the paper, and it won't be noticeable at all. So even though I was able to escape using the pen on the blossom, I need to use it on this area here. I think it's a good idea to try to minimize anything that would distract the viewer from looking at the main focal point, which would be the flower itself. So we want to just bring back these stems and leaves to being unexciting. And here is the finished piece. Thank you so much.